Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a core part of Australia's history, and anybody who represents Australia overseas or any Australian diplomat has a natural interest in the Gallipoli campaign and the Anzac history because it's a core part of our very earliest international engagement. As an individual Australian, I find it fascinating. I've always been very moved by the stories of the individual soldiers who lived through the conflict, and I find the stories of the sacrifice and the loss of those individuals, especially when you realise how young so many of them were, many of them younger than my 18-year-old son. It's heartbreaking to read those stories, so it gives you an appreciation for what that history is about, and Australia's part of it. And I think also it makes you, as a diplomat, really reflect, well, what's your job as a diplomat? And your job as a diplomat is to try to ensure that you don't end up in that sort of conflict situation if you could possibly avoid it. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's already the case, of course, that a huge number of Australians, young and old, travel to Turkey and to the Gallipoli Peninsula to see the site. This year we're expecting 8,000 Australians just on 25 April at the official ceremony itself, plus 2,000 New Zealanders. For Australians, you have to remember that we became an independent nation only in 1901, so only 14 years before the Gallipoli campaign. And at Gallipoli, every single Australian who was there was a volunteer soldier. So many of the Australians came from the same country town or the same suburban location in our larger cities. I think as an Australian, it also gives you reason to reflect on our place in the world. Why would Australians travel to the other side of the world to participate in a conflict? Well, of course, it has a sense of our historical roots since European settlement, of course, our British heritage, but it also has a sense of how we see ourselves contributing to the world, and we're not just an isolated part of the world a long way away from anywhere. We see ourselves very much as an engaged country in world affairs. Well, we know, with the benefit of hindsight, of course, that the Gallipoli campaign was a terrible tragedy for the Allied force, in fact for all the participants. So many tens of thousands of Turkish nationals and soldiers died. Tens of thousands of other Europeans died, and some 8,700 Australians died. All war is a tragedy, and so what we should be reflecting on, I think, today is how we can do more to prevent that sort of conflict occurring again. So, do we take lessons out of it? Of course they didn't die in vain. They believed they were dying for a very valid cause. I think the interesting thing out of the Gallipoli campaign, certainly in relation to our relations with Turkey, is we started off obviously in an environment of extreme conflict, and out of that conflict and during that conflict there arose, I think, a sentiment of respect and even friendship, even during the conflict, between the soldiers in a variety of interesting ways. This is well documented, of course. And from that beginning, I think our two countries, even though we're geographically very distant, have developed a very firm friendship and a very good relationship. I think, of course, because in a sense, you can't change history, so where you have a conflict, you can't undo that conflict as you go into the future. But what you can do is you can try to make sure that conflict wasn't in vain, and that the two sides, as two sides, you respect each other and come together, sometimes as friends, I guess sometimes not always as friends, but the most constructive and productive thing you can do coming out of a conflict like that is to reflect on, one, how can we avoid it happening again, and two, what are the positives that we can draw from it. You have the critical role of Ataturk, and of course those extraordinary words of Ataturk expressed after the war about your sons are our sons now. That's an incredible sentiment for the leader of a country which was victorious in that particular conflict, and I think that's something which really moved the Australian spirit at the time, and very much moved the survivors of the First World War. There's one example of the Turkish side throwing a note to the Australians attaching a packet of cigarettes, and it said in French, you know, take these cigarettes, smoke them with smoke them with pleasure, our heroic enemies. What a strange thing to say, in a sense, in the middle of a very bitter conflict, and to do that, and you know from reading those Australians' diaries and letters, they really did respect the Turks very, very much. They saw them as honourable fighters, they saw them as tough fighters, they saw them as defending their homeland as well. So it's interesting that sort of respect is, I don't think, such a common thing coming out of a conflict. I think the overwhelming sense amongst the Australians was one of looking after your mates. So it was about comradeship, it was about supporting each other. And these were all sentiments which I think, you know, European settlement in Australia at the time was only 140 years old. So, and Australia as an independent country was only 14 years old. So we were a very new country, and so that it was a terrible experience, of course, but that terrible experience was very much part of building the character of who we are today and how we see ourselves, and that notion of mateship, that notion of looking after each other, that notion of making a contribution. We find it absolutely excellent. I mean, Turkey is incredibly generous in allowing, at an official level, Australians to come every year and conduct really quite elaborate ceremonies on Turkish soil, of course. We have great partners in the municipality of Çanakkale, the governor of Çanakkale, the work done by the gendarmes done in that area, the work done by the national police, the cooperation we have with your military forces, all of this makes a critical difference as to whether or not we're able to perform these annual ceremonies. We do it every year, and Turkey provides maximum support, and we're very, very grateful for that. Well, we have a series of, first and foremost, I suppose, there's the role of our War Memorial in Canberra, which is both a building which lists the names of those who died in various conflicts, and in this, the centenary of Anzac, there are projects all over Australia, in all the parliamentary districts, for example. You have renovations of war memorials, you have activities which bring to life the history and individual stories of soldiers and their families. You have a very, very active program which seeks to make sure that all Australians remember the courage and the sacrifice of all of those involved in the campaign. Well, for example, we have the Anzac Day Schools Award, which is designed to encourage initiative and creativity in the way that schools commemorate Anzac Day, with an emphasis on inventiveness balanced with tradition. And so that's held every year. You have the Simpson Prize, which is a national competition for Year 9 and 10 students, and the competition encourages participants to focus on the significance of Anzac Day and to consider what Anzac Day means to them and to Australia. For example, the Australian War Memorial has a program where schools write messages on little crosses and identify the school that the cross comes from and the particular message, and individuals visiting the Gallipoli Peninsula are invited to put those memorials on an individual grave and to take a photograph and make sure that the school is informed. It depends. So for example, there are some schools in a state called Victoria which have a school exchange program with a school down in the Çanakkale region. I participated, I met the other day a group of people on what we call the Mateship Trek, and they were 18 and 19-year-olds who had raised funds to travel to Turkey and walk across the peninsula to the key main sites along the peninsula. Well, I think that the tribute, as I said before, actually, in a sense I've answered the question. I think the tribute by Ataturk to the fallen soldiers was an incredibly moving sentiment, and what it really conveyed was that modern Turkey had moved beyond the First World War and had moved beyond the enmity between the two sides and was looking to create new relationships. So I think for Australians, when they read those words and when they look at that beautiful Gallipoli Peninsula and the preserved area of the peninsula, which is a national park, they know that those remains of those soldiers truly are resting in peace. They know that the commitment given by Ataturk has been honoured, and I think that is a very important foundation to a very close friendship between our two countries.
Okay.
I think Ataturk stands out as somebody who had the true courage and vision of leadership, and that's why he's so respected in Turkey, and it's why he's respected internationally. And he is somebody who had a vision for not only his men at the time in his unit on the Gallipoli Peninsula, but he had a real vision for his country. And it's a unique person, of course, who is able to take that vision and turn it into reality. And of course, Ataturk stands out in 20th century history as one of the truly great leaders. It's a very good relationship, and you can't forget that a really important part of that relationship is the fact that we have about 80,000 Turkish Australians. The Turkish community were welcomed as immigrants to Australia in the 1960s and 70s, and they settled mostly in our two big urban centres, Melbourne and Sydney. They are grandchildren, they're prominent in business, they're prominent in our most prestigious professions.
You're talking about the Turks in Australia?
Turks in Australia, yes. So that's an important part of the modern relationship, and if you look at the areas where we can most successfully grow the relationship, I would say agriculture and agricultural expertise, mining technology, mining safety, and also education, getting Turkish students to come and study in Australian universities and getting Australian students to come and study in Turkish universities. I think it's a very good, warm and constructive relationship.
Yeah, exactly.
I think in a strange sense, it's almost a sense of coming to a place which is of profound significance as to who you are as an Australian. So when you first visit those grave sites of these young Australian men who died 100 years ago, and you're in this very beautiful, very peaceful location, and you hear the water lapping against the beach, you really reflect on what it must have been like to be a young man who had probably never travelled anywhere before, and certainly probably never travelled out of Australia, to have landed on that beach, completely foreign environment, and you would have landed on the Gallipoli beach and you would have looked up, and immediately from the beach, I don't know whether you know the geography, but immediately from the beach you have those cliffs, and they would have become aware very quickly that there were Turkish soldiers on the cliff tops. They must have been very daunted, I think, by that experience. It must have been a very, very demanding experience for these very inexperienced, very experienced young men.
Yeah.
Incredibly excited. I mean, I think to be on the ground in Turkey and then in Gallipoli on the 25th of April, it's an experience of a lifetime, and to be associated with it is an incredible honour. The core lesson is, one, we shouldn't forget the sacrifice of these young men, but we should take away from that experience what are the positives, and the positives certainly from an Australian perspective are the commitment to mateship, the commitment to looking after each other, the commitment to camaraderie, and above all, I think, the ability of both Australia and Turkey, having fought so bitterly together over that period, to walk away from that conflict and to walk away as friends, and having built out of that conflict a genuine and deep respect for each other.